So now, we're sort of continuing the theme slightly in that we're talking about people and humans. And we're going to turn to a subject that's of vital importance. Technology is helpful and game-changing, but at the center of everything is the human being. And the subject, I've often thought over my entire working life that one of the most difficult jobs in the world must be that of the call taker in a PSAP. And I have to say, we're on the awards night, just listening to the calm, efficient, yet eminently human recording of the ERC operator in Finland inspired my awe even further. It just gave me chills how you can stay calm and make decisions under that sort of thing. Yet we know that PSAP call takers are not immune from psychological distress, far from it. So this discussion is going to focus on protecting emotional and psychological well-being of PSAP employees. And I'm going to be talking to Dr. Michelle Lilly, who's Associate Professor of Clinical Psychology at, and I can never say this in one word, Northern Illinois University. It's really difficult to string together. Dr. Lilly's published many papers on this, and we're going to do this as a sort of conversation, and there will be questions at the end. And but we haven't got a hope of covering all the topics that need to be covered within the time span. And I think it merits a conference of its own, frankly. But you will find her details at the end of the session or in the conference brochure, and you are absolutely free to contact her, and she'd love to share her research and so forth. You may have also sat in on the session on the Great Resignation, which, again, Michelle chaired masterfully. It was interesting to note that while the stress and challenges of PSAPs might vary internationally, the core issues of the job do remain the same. It's how they're approached and dealt with that can differ. And until relatively recent, there was scarce research in this area, which is something that you're fixing, basically, and encouraging others to fix. And I was also struck by the presentation from SOS Alarm in Sweden, which emphasized setting expectations and standards, not just on the part of the employers, but also for the employees, and I hope to explore this in more detail. The other thing that arose from that was pride in working for one's employer and one's organization, which I would suggest varies regionally, nationally, internationally. But it shows it's not impossible. It can be done. We talked about trust very recently, in the last session, and I think that's a fundamental requirement too. There needs to be trust between employer, employee, new and seasoned employees, between the public, the PSAP, and the emergency services, because lack of trust can lead to feeling not valued, and in an already challenging job can have really damaging consequences. But you're not here to listen to me blather on, so we'll sit down and we'll actually start our conversation, shall we? So, why do PSAP employees experience such a high level of stress, Michelle?
Well, we know from decades of research that the 4 biggest predictors of stress is novelty, predictability, control, and social evaluation. So when we are constantly tasked with doing new and novel things, when we can't predict what's going to happen, when we don't have control, and when we're constantly being evaluated, we tend to experience our highest levels of stress. Now, this is basically a job ad for 111. I'm going to say 911 by accident, I'm sure, but because that's in the US. But 112 call takers, it's basically a job ad. There's constantly evolving technologies. There are new roles, new demands, new policies. You never know what's going to happen when you pick up that phone. And while you might try to restore a sense of control to the environment, oftentimes call takers have very limited control. And at least in the US, quality assurance is a very big thing. All of these calls are taped, reviewed. You're given lots and lots and lots of feedback about your performance. And in the United States, people from the general public can actually pull 911 calls and review them through the Freedom of Information Act. And so there is a very high level of social evaluation, including just sitting in a room with everybody plugged in. Yeah. So we know, for example, that if you put somebody in a room to do math problems by themselves, they're much faster and better at it than if you simply just put another human being doing math problems in the room, even if the person isn't talking to them. So just having more people in any one environment naturally enhances stress
That's
levels.
really interesting about the levels of scrutiny, and I hadn't realised that the public levels of scrutiny sort of, and as we just talked about in
Yes.
the last session, if
Yeah.
you don't understand something, you make something up. So that must be almost fighting waves of misinformation as well, or not understanding the way the job works, which must be incredible pressure.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And we see all the time a lot of negative media attention about the way that calls were handled, which certainly doesn't help.
No, no, I can imagine. So, what are the common emotional and psychological challenges that PSAP employees face?
Yeah, so there's not as much research out there as you might think about things like burnout and compassion fatigue. Those are kind of syndromes that working with emergency services I see a lot. So burnout is marked by just being tired, being depleted, having a hard time getting motivated. It looks a lot like depression, which we'll talk about in a second. Compassion fatigue is when it used to be called secondary traumatic stress, but it is when you're kind of your ability to continue to be compassionate with callers and people in crisis. Over time, that like reserve of compassion can kind of get depleted, and again, we see a lot of tiredness, a lot of just kind of physical and emotional kind of depletion, and we see a lot of enhanced apathy. People become more apathetic to callers, which is really kind of contradictory, right?
Just sort of going through the motions because that's the job, where I
Yep.
bet there's a conflict inside anyway. You know that you're doing it, but it's a self-protection thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, people become quite defensive because they know that they're becoming depleted in that reserve. And so those things are quite common. There's not as much research on it as you would think, but research does show that telecommunicators report a high level of compassion, fatigue, and burnout on daily, weekly, monthly basis. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and so I focus on clinical syndromes. So by that I mean things that you will find outlined in the ICD. In the US, we use the DSM to kind of classify psychological disorders. And my research has shown that anywhere between 17 and 24% of telecommunicators in the US qualify for diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is very concerning, almost a quarter. And we could talk all day long about how adverse mental health can affect your job performance and decision making and attention and concentration. We found that nearly a quarter of telecommunicators in the United States would qualify for diagnosis of depression. And about 15 to 20% have a clinical level of anxiety. So this is, of course, very concerning because, as I mentioned, the primary symptoms of these disorders are trouble with attention, trouble concentration, and so it's a real public safety concern.
I was going to say, because it's all those things you specifically need for this job.
Absolutely.
Is there, I mean, this is something, because we did have a lovely long chat before this session to sort of go over what we were going to discuss. I mean, your research is primarily US-based, isn't it? And we know there's not much research specifically on this globally, but you do, I mean, I take it some of the research can be transferable from other disciplines, can't they? Do you know of any studies in Europe or anywhere else on this?
I am not aware of any. So
Okay, well,
this is my call to all the people in the room. Reach out to me. I would love to collaborate on a research project because I think this is vitally important. I do think that the job in and of itself and the recurrent exposure to potentially traumatizing calls is going to confer risk regardless of where you are. But I would also anticipate seeing some diversity in those percentages because what we also know is that how an organization reacts to human suffering makes a huge difference in risk. So if you have an organization that responds well to somebody who's in distress, their risk for long-term psychological suffering is significantly diminished.
I think that brings us very neatly to my next question. Thank you. I mean, how do you recognize the signs of psychological and emotional stress and distress among employees?
Yeah, I think, and it's vitally important, right? Because what we see is that when people start avoiding and suppressing their distress, it really increases their risk for, again, the longer term disorders like depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. So those early signs are really important. What I often tell people is the best sign, there's several, but one is work avoidance. right?
Yeah.
If you have an employee who starts coming in a little late, is calling in sick a lot, what I see a lot in the United States is people no longer wanting to work certain channels, certain radio channels. Sometimes they don't want to sit at a particular console. So you see these kind of avoidant behaviors because those things like a console or certain channel have become kind of triggers of distress for them. So I think avoidance is one of the biggest things that you might notice.
Is that something that in your, in your experience, in your research, such avoidance, is it even understood by leadership to be a symptom of something deeper, or is it seen as just not performing your job properly?
Yeah, I think awareness of this is changing. So as we talked about yesterday, my first 911 conference was just 11 years ago. And I started talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, and the entire audience, which was about 7 people, were all sitting there like this, like glaring at me. I was told by a number of people that I was going to ruin the 911 industry by talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, that everybody was going to quit and pretend that they were sick, and it was going to destroy the industry. So I think there's increasing awareness now of this problem, and I'm seeing more and more leadership and management trying to recognize these signs. But avoidance can be tricky to notice.
And that's so once you've identified there's an issue or someone has observed an issue, whether it's leadership, supervisor, or a colleague, because you've got to keep an eye out on each other as well, and they're probably the ones who are going to notice first. So, what can you do about it?
Yeah, well, it's critically important to be prepared, right? So I think one of the biggest challenges is just spreading more information and knowledge about these risks, and normalizing that. I hate this phrase, it drives me crazy, but it's okay to be okay. I know it's like that, but I'm just like, it's so trite. But there is a long-standing history in emergency services of this kind of suck it up buttercup, right? You just suck it up, you just keep moving forward, and there are no other options, right? But what I always say is, we know from philosophy, we know from psychology that human beings connect most through our suffering, right? The people that we feel closest with are people with whom we've gone through some real shit, right? Like we've been through stuff with these people, right? Those are the people that we're most connected with. And so it makes perfect sense that it hurts, right? People go into this job because they want to save lives, they want to help people. They come in with that compassion. We know that many people from emergency services have their own traumatic backgrounds, right? They've experienced things in childhood that make them want to help people. So when you feel as though you're trying to help people and something bad happens, you lose a life or something doesn't go right, it hurts.
That feeling of failure or personal guilt, which is inevitably misplaced, but profound. And this can also manifest itself. I mean, we're talking about the psychological distress and so forth. But again, we talked yesterday how this can then turn into physical problems, and it becomes a whole vicious cycle, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know, and we don't have time for this, and I am not a medical doctor. Maybe we have some in the field, but we know that long-term stress and distress can really mess up our entire endocrine system. We start having cortisol dysregulation, which can lead to weight gain, heart problems, even things like asthma, we're learning. This is already an occupation that, given the high level of stress, is at risk for poor physical health, in addition to the fact that you have people sitting at a console for hours and hours and hours. And so my research has shown that, and again, this is the United States, but 83% of telecommunicators were overweight or obese. 83%. Now, Americans tend to be a little on the heavier side, but that's about 2.5 times the national average.
Wow, that's a very distressing statistic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So when you were chairing the other session, and again, we've talked about this, so sorry to bring it up, but and this is, I understand it's not a problem that is common to PSAPs all over the world, because each one operates with its own specific national and regional culture. But you talked about, and I mentioned it in my introduction, there can be, let's call it headbutting, between culture, the generations and younger people and so forth. Now, I know that this isn't necessarily a problem in wherever you're from, but I know it also might be. So can we talk about that a little bit further?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's very significant challenge that I see, and my husband and I train law enforcement across the state that we live in, across the country, and we see the kind of older generation of law enforcement, older generation 911, and the kind of younger generation having some headbutting. That's a great word. I think I mentioned the other day in the session that there's kind of this culture of kind of eating your young, and so when these new trainees come in, many don't make it out, and it's not because they don't have the skills. It's because the work schedule for this younger generation is something that if it doesn't work for them, they're going to walk. They vote with their feet, so it's, I think, the work schedule, but a lot of it is the dynamics within the environment that people don't want to stay. And so what we see a lot is this kind of older generation saying, well, we did it, you have to do it, right? And there's not a recognition that it's just different, right? The generations are different. They care about different things. I'll see older generation folks, working 17 doubles, in a row and having quite a bit of frustration that some of the younger folks are unwilling to take the overtime. But that's just a generational shift, at least in the United States, where there's more emphasis on kind of self-care, and I'm not going to let this job take me down. So we see a lot of that happening, and it's a detriment to recruitment and retention.
But I suppose also it's the system. If you're having to do that much overtime, then it's not anyone's generation. Maybe just because people put up with it doesn't mean it's right, does it?
No, absolutely. So understaffing, I'm sure this varies quite a bit across the different nations represented in this room, but understaffing is so insanely rampant in the United States that I regularly speak with people who are working 16-hour, 18-hour shifts, and there's just simply no relief.
And that we've sort of covered the question about whether it is duty-related trauma the primary source of stress in the PSAP. I think we've just answered that. Is it the job or the culture? It seemed it could be both. It really very much, I think the job is the baseline, isn't it, of stress. That is going to be a stressful job. But then if you have a culture that isn't helping or looking out for people or doesn't understand, then that's going to make it immeasurably worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, there just kind of needs to be some shift in recognizing that this is an inherently stressful job, and some of the things that you encounter as a human being can reasonably affect you. I think, to do this job, you have to be an avoider. You have to be good at emotional suppression, right? If I call emergency services, I don't want the person to be crying. I want them to handle my call, right? And so that kind of emotional suppression, I think, is a natural consequence of working in this job. But when it becomes your primary way of focusing, it can become a problem. And I think that organizations sometimes kind of collude in this avoidance, right? We're all fine, we're good, right? And there's not this recognition of being affected. So then when people are affected, they think something's wrong with them. They feel intense shame. There's guilt. There's questions about whether or not they can or should be doing the job. And there's fear about getting help, right? But what we know is that there are excellent evidence-based treatments for conditions like depression and PTSD. So, there's a long-standing history of believing that you have PTSD and you're done. You can't do the job, you're gonna have PTSD forever. As a clinical psychologist, and I'm saying this knowing, I'm gonna knock on wood, that I'm gonna get home and get a client and it's not gonna go well, but I've never treated somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder who didn't lose their diagnosis through the work. And I'm not talking about laying on this couch for 2 years, and we're going to talk about your mom and your dad. We're talking about brief, evidence-based treatments where the protocols are about 8 to 15 sessions. And so I've worked with many emergency responders who came in who were really, really suffering and they're back to work.
And again, it's back to trust. They have to trust that something can be done, don't they?
Well, trust is huge because the other kind of backside of this is betrayal, right? So there's a growing literature on what we call institutional betrayal, and that is when the institution turns their back on you, betrays you. And we know that betrayal is one of the most detrimental human emotions that we can experience. When you are betrayed by people, by institutions, by your organizations, it naturally increases this kind of sense of like shame and guilt and what did I do? And it leads to more of that emotional suppression coping. Because if you work in an institution that you feel could betray you or doesn't have your back, but you still have to go to work, because you got to go to work and you got to pay your bills, you're just white knuckling it, right? You're going in and you already have that stress and anxiety. And what we know very much from the research literature is that your mindset and how you think about things is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then we pick out things in our environment that are consistent with what we think. So if you keep thinking, oh my gosh, my organization is going to betray me, you start looking for all the evidence of betrayal. And it kind of throws you into a potentially negative cycle.
That's quite distressing, actually, isn't it?
I'm never very popular at parties.
So anyway, cheerful.
People are like, "What do you study?" I'm like, "Trauma," right? It's fine.
Well, let's turn.
Just give them alcohol.
Yeah. Well, I think we did last night. That might not be helping, frankly. Yeah. So, I mean, if we turn to some of the responsibilities and actions that leadership can take to decrease levels of stress in PSAPs before everyone reaches this stage, or even just minimizing it? Is it a matter of prioritizing resources, creating that mental health culture? Are there easy steps that, I mean, obviously they don't have to be easy, but there are really simple steps they can take to start on their way to doing that?
Yeah, this one's an easy one for me. Like, I'm a professor and an educator and trainer. So of course I believe in the power of knowledge, right, and information. So having some trainings on, this is kind of a normal reaction, kind of creating cultures that suggest that it's okay to sometimes have a strong emotional reaction is huge. I think one of the kind of critical areas in organizations that I try to focus on is that kind of supervisory level, because you have those folks who are, they're not frontline and they're kind of overseeing these folks, but they're almost this conduit through like the frontline folks and management, and they play a very critical role. So I think, and oftentimes those folks have come out of the organizations, right? And so they kind of perpetuate this idea of like, well, you just can move on, right? You just have to keep pushing, suck it up. And so I think that kind of layer of the organization is critically important. And then one thing, some organizations, I learned Romania, for example, has 24/7 psychological support for their call takers, which is amazing. That is something I would love to see more across the United States, and I certainly don't, most don't. But I work with a number of organizations where I have an agreement with them that their call takers can call me and set up private, confidential sessions, and the only information that they get from me is whether or not the sessions are used. They don't know the name, they don't know the date, they don't know what was discussed, there are no notes. Because at least in the United States, if people think that it's going to get back to their employer, they're not going to talk. So setting up those structures.
And I think sort of historically, sometimes that's been seen as a bit of a punishment as well, hasn't it? You were making you go and talk about yourself and your issues, and that's overcoming that must be quite a barrier too.
It is. It's a huge barrier. And I know one of the things that they're at least doing in Illinois with law enforcement is they're at the state level requiring that every officer every year gets at least 1 hour of counseling. And most of them are going to go in and just like glare at the person, for the first year or two. But the idea is to kind of normalize that, a psychologist is just a person, and you can use that session or you cannot, and just to kind of increase comfort and contact.
Interesting. So we've got a little bit more time, I think. So I'm going to move on to something we weren't sure whether we'd be able to discuss or not. So I read the paper that you wrote about looking at next generation technology and possible implications that this might have on call takers and PSAPs and so forth. And I was surprised by your findings and pleasantly surprised by some of your findings. So perhaps you could discuss those a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm happy to send to anybody who wants it. I wrote a white paper on the potential for positive psychological impact by having video imagery. So ever since I started working with 911, which, again, was about a little over a decade ago, this kind of NG 911 and video imagery was like on the horizon. And everybody would say to me like, oh, it's going to destroy the industry, right? Like this is really going to mess people up to have to witness this. And I think at first, too, I was like, yeah, I wouldn't want to watch that, right? Especially if you signed up for this job and it wasn't part of your, duties. I could see why that would cause a lot of anxiety. However, what we know from the theoretical and psychological literature is that there's a lot of reasons to believe that having access to video could be very helpful, right? We know, for example, that knowing call outcome can make a world of difference. Our brains like nice, clear, coherent stories that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when we don't know how something ends, or we can't make sense of it, our brain has a hard time kind of time-stamping it and cataloging it as a memory. So then what happens is, you're driving down the street, or you're taking a shower, or you're doing something kind of mindless, and your brain pops that thought and that kind of issue into your brain. Because your brain is thinking, hey, now is a perfect time to try to make sense of what happened. So when we don't know things like call outcome or we don't know details, it actually can enhance risk. Now, I've worked with some people who say, I kind of like that because what I say to myself is, they're fine, they got the help they needed, and they just go about their day. But for some people, it's a real challenge. We also know from some cognitive psychology literature that if you have groups of people that watch a really grotesque video and they can see it, and then they had a group where you could see and hear it, and then a group that could just hear it, we know that the people who could only hear it had a lot more intrusive thoughts about it.
They had imagination fills in the gaps, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Our brains fill in gaps, right? Yeah. Our brains can be very creative, right? And getting back to that mindset, right? If we're kind of thinking the worst things happen from working in this field for a long time, or we tend to have a more negative mindset, our brain is going to fill in more negative details.
So on balance, it could be, as long as with the right training and right support and the right understanding of what the technology is there for, and possibly mentioning these benefits as well, it could be a really useful development in the future.
Absolutely. And we're having a lot of, I'm hearing about all sorts of wins across the United States as this technology gets adopted. People are finding lost children. They're able to help people in ways that they were not able to help them before. And again, if you went into this job to save lives, which I'm sure most people did, you didn't do it for the great hours, or the, amazing benefits. You did it at least partly because you want to help people and save lives. And to the extent that technology can help, we're going to help the psychological health.
That's good. So we're going to open the floor to any questions that people might have for Michelle. Do we have any questions in the audience? I can't see anybody. Oh, yes, we have one here, please. Oh, sorry, we're going there first, then we'll come to you. I need to turn around.
Hi, Dr. Lilly. Thanks for the information. Can we talk a little bit more about the techniques that are used? Because I think that's ultimately what the people are after, is understanding how can we help people quickly. And I think what you're doing is helping along that way. I'm not a big fan of the traditional psychology approach because there's much faster approaches, but what you were talking about seemed to be much more along the lines of new EFT, TFT, hypnosis, and so on. So do you have something to say on those techniques that could help address the issue the day of and the following day?
Yeah, so you're talking about trauma-focused treatments? Yeah. I will say a couple of things. First, I have a lot of leadership management coming to me and they say, we require everybody to do debriefing no matter what, right? I will just say the research does not support that, right? People should be given the space that they want and desire, and they should have agency after a critical event. Having those resources available is great if people want to talk immediately, but sometimes people don't, right? And research has actually shown if you force people to talk right away and they don't want to, it can sometimes make things worse. So having those resources available is really, really important. But what's, to me, and again, I could be biased as a trauma psychologist, there are a number of very well-supported, evidence-based trauma-focused treatments. So, one of them is called prolonged exposure therapy, and the whole goal of prolonged exposure therapy is just to get people to, it short-circuits the avoidance, and it helps people emotionally process an event. Another is called cognitive processing therapy. It's received tons of support. And in that therapy, what you're doing is you're kind of addressing that mindset about trauma and kind of correcting some of that mindset, right? So I'll give you a quick example. I've worked with sexual assault survivors who say things like, all men are evil, right? Now, if you're walking out in your world, there are a lot of men, right? So it's very easy to be triggered, right? And so it's perpetuating that distress. And so what you're doing is helping people kind of rethink some of those assumptions. Now, I'm not going to tell somebody like, oh, the world's safe and lovely and go jump around in a field of daisies, you'll be great, right? But it's kind of getting people back to that more kind of measured beliefs about the world, which is that, yes, there are some people in the world who are evil. It's not a very high percentage. I know some of you probably disagree with me, but and you can take steps to protect yourself. But it's really trying to address those things people tell themselves that perpetuate the distress and anxiety. And then the other is called EMDR, called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And what EMDR does is has people kind of think about previous traumatic events while engaging in some sort of bilateral stimulation. So that bilateral stimulation is sometimes moving your eyes back and forth, sometimes it's with hand tappers, and sometimes it's an acoustic. You wear like earmuffs and there's like a tone that goes back and forth. And EMDR is kind of based on the idea that engaging in that bilateral stimulation decouples the kind of memory from that strong affect associated with it. That's a very, very overgeneralized description of EMDR. But research out of the United States suggests that all three of these evidence-based treatments are, they're manualized, they're short, and they are meant to be 15 to 20 sessions or less. So, did that answer your question? EMDR what? EMDR is really good. Yeah, people love EMDR, and I'm a fan of EMDR. One thing I will say about EMDR is you have to find a really good EMDR practitioner. If you have, in the United States at least, if you have a couple $1,000s, you can be a really crappy clinician and go get certified in EMDR and still not really know what you're doing. Whereas some of these other approaches like prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy, typically it's people who have pretty advanced trauma-focused training. So EMDR is great, but if you go that route, make sure you find a really good clinician who's offering it.
Get the right person, the research.
Yeah.
So did you still have a question? Yes, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have a question. During the career of a call taker, I can relate to all the things you say about trauma and problems. Unfortunately, I see it increasing when people are working 15, 20, 25 years in a PSAP. So that concerns me because in the end of their career, we see them leaving with a lot of frustration and disbelief in the working of in a PSAP. So what I am interested in is it realistic to have a career of 25 years or 30 years in a PSAP? Because we're doing a lot to avoid these kind of traumas, but we see it increasing with the age and the periods of absence become longer.
Yeah, certainly over time, you can just kind of get physically and psychologically depleted by it. So in the United States, again, there was kind of this long-standing history of treating call takers as essentially secretaries, and there was lack of acknowledgement that this could actually over time impact you. In the United States, some of the research that I've published has been used for job reclassification, and so call takers can now retire as early as like police officers and firemen can. So it's no longer required to have, you know, a 30, 35-year career before you can start, for example, drawing a pension or retirement. It's such a hard question, right? Because I've seen some really hardy, robust, resilient people make it in this job for 30, 35 years, and they're doing fine. I wish we could take that resilience and bottle it and give it to everybody else. I think I feel the same about law enforcement. It's I think I don't know that I personally believe that people should be doing this job for 30 to 35 years. But that's, you know, there's no data on that. I don't have any, you know, research on that. I just think it's such a stressful job. And even if you don't get flustered by it, even if you tend to be quite resilient, even if you kind of thrive off some of the adrenaline, that kind of recurrent adrenaline rush still wears you down physically. So it's not probably a very popular answer. Don't tell your your retirement people I said that.
But I wonder what...
This isn't being recorded, is it?
It is. But coming down, you know, after retirement as well, that must be quite difficult to sort of then come down from all that perpetual adrenaline, repeated stress all the time, mustn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Takes a while.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's hard because in order to continue in this career, you have to develop some pretty good avoidance coping strategy, right? But over time, again, if that's your primary way of dealing with any stress,
it's going to be interesting on retirement. Mm-hmm. Do we have any further questions? I am gazing eagle-eyed out the... Right, one last question here, please. So.
Thank you for your presentation. It's been fascinating. And focusing on PSAP telecommunicators is really interesting. But I was also just thinking how much of this applies to sign language interpreters who are processing these calls as a third party. I work for an organization called Sorensen, and we have over 5,000 sign language interpreters around the globe, working in multiple countries, providing interpreting services, and many of them are emergency calls. You mentioned about supervision and how important that role is. And obviously you've been talking about PSAP operators, but thinking about sign language interpreters going through a similar process and making sure that they too have similar systems and structures and support systems.
Yeah, it is critically important. In fact, I actually did some research with video interpreters, and I have a data set that has, it's not large, but it's got about 200 people who have worked as video interpreters to look at their reactions, the psychological reactions, and it is very similar to what we see in 911 telecommunicators. I will say, because I'm really busy, I've never published that data, but maybe that'll be my next white paper, because those are easier. You don't have to go through the whole review process. Yeah, so you just write whatever you want. But yeah, I have that data. And I've also been approached by people who are legal videographers, and they've said, hey, what about us? And I've said, that's really interesting, and I think it's really important, but I just haven't gotten there yet. So absolutely, I think there's a lot of kind of similar occupations that have that inherent risk. I had even in the United States, they're kind of testing out automated taxi services, right? So you have people who are operating remotely driverless taxis, and they've thought about like what might be some of the impacts for their operators if this car that they're operating, you know, crashes into somebody. So,
gosh. That's stuff of science fiction,
we'll,
isn't it?
We'll go find a driverless taxi after this and take a joyride.
We'll test that. Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for at the moment. Thank you very, very much, Michelle.
Thank you for having me.